Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we talk about the next phase of the 1960s. The shortest decade started out so optimistic and ended up in absolute turmoil. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to analyze how the Vietnam War transformed American politics and culture. You should be able to assess the sources and significance of the rights revolution of the late 1960s. You should be able to examine the ways in which 1968 was a climactic year for the 1960s. And you should be able to discuss how the civil rights movement changed mid-60s. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 17. And here we see some transitions in the black movement and the turn from like a classic civil rights movement into more of a African-American identity issue. There was also this question of whether or not white people had fulfilled their duties to African Americans. U.S. racial tensions hadn't subsided since the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and in some places tensions were actually getting worse. But a lot of white Americans felt like the act and the efforts of the Freedom Rides had fulfilled their obligations to equality before the law, and that their job was mostly finished. While many black Americans felt like racial inequality was greater than just reaching political rights. With black unemployment of twice that of white unemployment and the average black family income about half of what white people were earning, the civil rights movement looked for ways to make freedom real for black Americans. In 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. proposed a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged to go end economic deprivation. He said that a society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for the Negro. Subpoint B. It's in that context that we see a number of riots and racial unrest. Race riots erupted in Harlem in 1964, and they were mostly fights between black residents and the police force, which was mostly white, who many consider the neighborhood basically like an occupying force. A far greater riot broke out the next year in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles on August 11th to August 16th in 1965. And what happened was that on August 11th, an African-American motorist was arrested for suspicion of drunk driving. The arrest provoked an argument between the accused man and his mother, who lived nearby. Then a fight broke out between the man and his mother versus the arresting police officers, and the fight continued to grow, with rumors spreading that the police had roughed up the driver and kicked his mother, eventually turning into a small mob scene. More officers were called and the crowd grew, but the police were pelted with rocks and chunks of concrete, and the mob eventually swelled into a 46-square-mile zone of fighting over 6 days. It resulted in 50,000 black rioters attacking and killing policemen and firemen, looting white business owners, and burning buildings. It took 15,000 National Guardsmen to call in to go establish the order, and the total cost was 35 people killed and 900 injured, and somewhere around $30 million in property damage. By the summer of 1967, the violence was so widespread that Lyndon Johnson had to appoint a committee to go study the problem. The result was the 1968 Kerner Report, which blamed violence on segregation and poverty. He writes, "Our nation is moving in 2 societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal." This was kind of a shock towards a lot of mainstream observers who said, moving? We're already 2 societies. In 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. launched the Chicago Freedom Movement with demands quite different from what the civil rights activists were calling for in the South. This new Chicago Freedom Movement advocated ending discrimination by employers and unions and demanding equal access to mortgages and the integration of public housing and making low-income housing available in different communities, not just in black neighborhoods. The usual tactics, though, of marches and sit-ins and mass arrests, they just didn't seem to carry the same weight in the North. It seemed to be largely ineffective, and ultimately the movement failed. Mayor Daley's political machine and entrenched white landowners just couldn't be moved. It's as if the same magic that happened with Martin Luther King Jr. in the South just didn't seem to work in the North. The problems were different. Subpoint C. While Martin Luther King Jr. was promoting nonviolent civil disobedience, others in the African-American community suggested other tactics. And I think this is an important thing for us moderns to remember, that while Martin Luther King Jr. certainly is one of the great figures of the civil rights movement, he's not the only figure, and his tactic of nonviolence was not the only tactic for African-Americans to try to achieve greater rights. And maybe the greatest example of it is a man named Malcolm Little. Well, he was born Malcolm Little, but he began signing his name Malcolm X to go replace his family name, which he said was a leftover from his slave ancestry. Though long skeptical of religion, X converted to Islam while in prison. Upon parole, he was even named assistant minister at a Detroit mosque and quickly expanded its membership. He was monitored by the FBI, though, as a self-described communist. X had insisted that black people must control the political and economic resources of their own communities, relying on their own efforts rather than working with white people. After a trip to Mecca, Malcolm X began to speak of the possibility of interracial cooperation for radical change in the United States. Subpoint D. It's in this milieu that we see the rise of a new movement in African American life known as the Black Power movement. SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael used the phrase Black Power during a march in Mississippi, and the slogan became that term became the slogan of the movement. The Black Power movement appealed to people who were bitter over the federal government's failure to stop violence against civil rights workers, and white attempts to go determine movement strategy, and the civil rights movement's failure to have any real impact on the economic problems of the black ghettos. The Black Power movement encompassed everything from electing black politicians to the belief that black Americans needed a revolution of liberation, similar to the American Revolution. Another slogan also emerged at the same time, the Black is Beautiful idea, and it gave rise to black beauty pageants, specifically black clothing styles and the Afro hairdo. Inspired by the ideas of black determination, civil rights organizations gave up interracial efforts, pursuing black unity instead. New militant groups sprang up, and the most notable example was the Black Panther Party, notorious for advocating armed self-defense against police brutality and wearing military garb. While the Black Panther Party helped run schools and health clinics, they also warred with the police. Infighting and the loss of leaders to police shootings eventually ended that movement. Roman numeral number 18. The turmoil isn't just related to racial issues. There's also a question of what's the future for the leftist liberal approach in America. Whereas African Americans had self-evident grievances, the problems facing young white liberals were a little harder for a lot of people to understand. Society was providing greater opportunities and a higher standard of living than ever had happened before, but young people seemed to be rejecting the values of society. Young liberals characterized liberals of a previous generation as the old left, and who considered the Soviet Union to be the model of change and that the working class was the agent of change. But this new left was more interested in matters of loneliness and isolation and alienation instead of economic equality and social citizenship. Its inspiration was the Black Freedom Movement. In a broad sense, black and white protesters didn't have much in common. The black protesters had been excluded from society, and white protesters were largely the children of the middle class, but both believed that society's evils were deeply embedded and must be directly challenged. An organization called the Students for a Democratic Society wrote a Port Huron statement criticizing institutions like political parties and corporations and unions. The SDS believed in a participatory democracy where social arrangements like workplaces and schools and government should be left to the direct individual involvement in the decisions those that affected their lives. The statement was never clear exactly what it meant, but it suggested that the elitism of the old left progressives and post-war economic planners no longer seemed to apply. In 1964, the University of California, Berkeley was a big impersonal college whose students were upset at limits on freedom of speech. The ensuing free speech movement of thousands of students successfully challenged the college, leading to a repeal of the rules. In a broader sense, it also meant that students had a major voice on college campuses, and that major voice was put to work pretty quickly in subpoint B, was the student protest transforms into a full-fledged generational movement motivated by the war in Vietnam. The United States government seemed to be fairly ignorant of the Vietnamese culture or history or the current situation in the country or countries, tending to believe that the United States could basically just swoop in, do easy nation building whenever and wherever they pleased. The Kennedy administration wanted to go promote the counterinsurgency in Vietnam, hoping to stop the spread of communism in the Third World, and fearing that the public would never forgive them for losing Vietnam. That fear made it impossible for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson to ever really pull out of the situation, no matter how untenable it got. Subpoint C. When the North Vietnamese patrol boat saw a U.S. ship on a spy mission, they opened up fire on a U.S. ship. Johnson claimed that it was an act of aggression and it needed an answer. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, authorizing the president to take all necessary measures to repel an armed attack in Vietnam. Although Johnson campaigned in 1964 against sending U.S. troops to Vietnam, troops arrived by 1965. And 8 Americans were killed, and Johnson ordered sustained bombing of the North. U.S. troops were sent to South Vietnam to go battle the Viet Cong, and by 1967, over 500,000 U.S. troops were serving there. By 1968, the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam exceeded 500,000, and the conduct of the war had become very brutal. Subpoint D. The Viet Cong used hit-and-run ambush tactics that were very difficult to defend against. Tunnels crossing the country helped withstand airstrikes, and also used to launch attacks and to connect villages. The terrain was laced with booby traps and landmines laid by both the United States and the Viet Cong. U.S. General Westmoreland tried to destroy Viet Cong morale through attrition, but the Viet Cong were receiving supplies from China and the Soviet Union and staying defiant. The United States saw the war as a military struggle, but the Vietnamese had a different view. The Viet Cong saw it as a battle for their very survival, and that motivation made a big difference. Weapons for exposing tunnels, wounded civilians, and destroyed villages. And a couple of tactics of the war remain famous today. The first of napalm. Napalm is a gasoline-based bomb that sets fire to the jungles. It's like a sticky kind of inflammatory that it's very destructive. But also Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a defoliant. It was a leaf-killing toxic chemical that was blown over the jungles of Vietnam, and soon after, all the leaves would fall off the trees and expose what was going down below. Agent Orange also proved to be particularly toxic to humans, both the people who were just, had it fall on them, to the babies inside the mother's womb that were exposed to its chemicals, to the American soldiers dropping it themselves. Agent Orange, a particularly bad weapon. Subpoint E. Morale eventually began to fall in the Vietnam War as guerrilla warfare and jungle conditions and the lack of progress towards achieving any kind of an end in sight. It was all lowering U.S. morale. Many American soldiers turned to alcohol and drugs, and some even went as far as trying to kill their superior officers. Still, though, most U.S. soldiers, and this part isn't told well enough, still most U.S. soldiers believed in halting communism and fought courageously and took patriotic pride in fulfilling their duty. Back home, opposition to the war became the organizing theme that united all kinds of doubts and discontents. The burden of fighting fell on the working class and the poor. Many white and affluent young men got a college deferment, and 80% of the U.S. soldiers came from the lower economic levels. It's like the old charge of the Civil War, that it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. The Students for a Democratic Society began anti-war demonstrations in 1965. War seemed like the opposite of the participatory democracy they were hoping for. By 1967, draftees were burning draft cards or fleeing to Canada to avoid what they considered to be an unjust war. 100,000 people protested at the Lincoln Memorial and at the Pentagon. Combat footage on nightly television news showed a stark picture of war and profoundly shaped public opinion. Subpoint F. As the 60s progressed, young Americans' understanding of freedom increasingly expanded to include cultural freedom as well. Liberation was a massive redefinition as a rejection of all kinds of authority, and that everybody, the line was everybody over 30 shouldn't be trusted. The counterculture in some ways represented not rebellion, but in a way, fulfillment of the consumer marketplace. Essentially, every whim could be entertained. It's freedom, but it's a freedom that maybe would have been not understandable to an earlier generation. Roman numeral number 19. I want to also talk about freedom and liberation movements in a different sense. And I think maybe the first big example of it is the women's movement. What's often known as the women's liberation or second wave feminist movement. In 1963, the journalist Betty Friedan wrote The Feminist Mystique, criticizing the idea that the primary goal of women was to pursue marriage and motherhood. She compared the suburban home to essentially a comfortable concentration camp. The Feminist Mystique had a broad impact, pushing lawmakers to address feminist concerns through the Equal Pay Act of 1964 and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and their efforts for equality in the workplace. Women of the civil rights movement concluded that treatment of women in society wasn't much better than treatment of black people in society. By 1967, women throughout the country were establishing consciousness-raising groups to discuss the ideas and the sources of their discontent. This new feminism burst onto the national scene at the Miss America beauty pageant of 1968, demonstrating inside the hall where the pageant was held. Outside on the boardwalk, demonstrators had a freedom trash can where they threw away their issues of Playboy and Cosmopolitan magazines, as well as bras and high-heeled shoes. Subpoint B, women believed that the personal is political, thus permanently changing Americans' definition of freedom. Sexual relations, the conditions of marriage, the standards of beauty were much more a political topic as the Vietnam War was a political topic, or civil rights or class tensions. That family life was a political topic seemed to reject the ideas of 1950s era public conformity. The countercultural notion of liberation centered on the free individual, and it became the most important apparent in the sexual revolution of the time that severed sex from procreation. Radical feminists' first public campaign to demand repeal of state laws banning abortions or leaving it up to physicians to decide whether a pregnancy should be terminated. Subpoint C. Under the guidance of Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court vastly expanded the rights of all Americans. In 1957, the court moved to rein in the anti-communist crusade. The court continued to guard civil liberties and freedom of the press. And in the 1960s, the court continued to push towards racial equality as well, most notably in the Loving v. Virginia case. The court declared that Virginia's anti-miscegenation statute, that the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, was unconstitutional, that people could be in interracial marriages, as a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The court simultaneously pushed forward the process of imposing on the states the obligation to respect the liberties as outlined in the Bill of Rights. Take, for instance, Miranda v. Arizona, where the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination now requires law enforcement officials to advise a suspect interrogated in custody of his or her rights to remain silent and to obtain an attorney. If you get arrested a lot or watch a lot of cop shows, you know of the Miranda rights, but they weren't always, while a person might have always had those rights, it wasn't always clear to the person arrested. Subpoint D. The Warren Court outlined entirely new rights as well, in response to the rapidly changing contours of American society. And a couple of these became pretty famous. The first was Griswold v. Connecticut, that challenged a Connecticut law criminalizing the use of contraceptives, and it was found to have violated the marital privacy rights. Also, the infamous Roe v. Wade decision, where a Texas law making it a crime to assist a woman to get an abortion was found to have violated her due process rights. Griswold and Roe unleashed a flood of rulings and laws that seemed to accept the feminist view of the family as a collection of sovereign individuals rather than a single unit. It became an atomized type of family. The nuclear family was now no longer gathered around a nucleus of identity. It was split apart into its constituents. Roman numeral number 20. And now I want to focus in particular on the year of 1968, which for my money goes in the short list as one of the worst years in American history. And it began with a surprise attack in 1968 as Vietnamese villagers went to the cities to go celebrate Tet, Vietnamese New Year, more or less. It coincided with a week-long truce for the holiday. The event was a confusing day of funerals for war victims and holiday parades. It was also used by the Viet Cong to go smuggle weapons to resistance movements in the South. That night, the Viet Cong attacked 100 towns and 12 U.S. bases. The Tet Offensive lasted a month before the U.S. and the South Vietnamese regained control. Though General Westmoreland declared that the attacks were a military defeat for the Viet Cong, it was a turning point in public opinion. Before Tet, most Americans were hawkish on the war, and afterwards both hawks and doves polled at about 40%, showing that the split was becoming more even. The mainstream media, though, was not split, and it became more openly critical of the war. Subpoint B. 1968 was also the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed by James Earl Ray in April. Martin Luther King Jr. was under FBI observation at the time, and people were immediately suspicious that there was a conspiracy involved. But also the shooting of King meant that there was race riots breaking out in over 100 U.S. cities. Subpoint C. Johnson's Secretary of Defense, Robert Mcnamara, decided that the war was essentially unwinnable, and as the author of it, announced his resignation. His successor, Clark Clifford, agreed with McNamara and began to figure out the plan for the drawdown. Johnson's popularity had also taken a severe drop, with 60% of Americans disapproving of how Johnson was handling the war. Seeing that he probably wouldn't win re-election in 1968, he actually withdrew from the race in March of that year, saying, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." In the Democratic Party power vacuum, several challengers emerged to go run against each other that year. The first of them was Senator Eugene McCarthy, no relation to Joe McCarthy. He ran as a dove to get America out of the Vietnam War as quickly as possible. Also, Senator Robert Kennedy, the former Attorney General, brother of John F. Kennedy, entered the race after LBJ's poor showing in New Hampshire. RFK made it to June of 1968 and was ultimately assassinated after winning the California primary. When RFK was killed, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota entered the race, and he casted himself as the heir of Kennedy's legacy. Vice President Hubert Humphrey ended up actually winning the Democratic nomination, an old politics candidate instead of the new politics candidate. He just seemed like the safer horse. The 1968 Democratic Convention was held in Chicago, and over 10,000 demonstrators went to the city that year, forcing Mayor Daley to mobilize the police and the National Guard. When protesters marched outside the convention, the police beat the protesters, and riots then broke out. But riots weren't just limited outside the convention. Inside the convention also was conflict, as the delegates bitterly debated an anti-war plank, causing tough party infighting. Maybe not fighting with fists, but a fight nonetheless. Subpoint D. The year's events opened the door for a conservative reaction, and the Nixon campaign's promises to restore law and order and to end the war in Vietnam resonated very strongly with Americans. He often talked about the silent majority, a group of middle Americans, as being overshadowed in the media by the more vocal minority. They didn't join in the large demonstrations against the Vietnam War at the time, and the silent majority didn't join in the counterculture, and they didn't participate in the public discourse. And he said, "And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support." That year, Alabama Governor George Wallace also ran for president as a third-party candidate. Wallace was made famous in 1963 for his opposition to the Civil Rights Movement and his refusal to integrate the University of Alabama, declaring that he stood for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Though the popular vote was close between Nixon and Humphrey, not so much Wallace, Nixon won the presidency with a significant electoral majority. 1968 was a tumultuous year. It's one of those transitional years in American history, and the transition launches us towards a new future that I can't wait to tell you more about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.